Look right like this.
Yeah.
Awesome. Hi, welcome to Going Home. This is the first of 3 planned conversations. I'm Dan. I'm the moderator of Coffee with Dan, which is an occasional series that goes on in Iowa City. And today's event is co-sponsored by the University of Iowa Stanley Museum of Art, the Obermann Center, the Office of Outreach and Engagement's theme semester, and Merge, who is hosting us today. So that's who we have to credit for this. A few opening comments before we start. One of the reasons why we're doing this is because home has always been something central to human dreams. Whether it takes the form of nostalgia and the dream of returning to a home that one has left, or the ability to claim land and build something toward the future, home is something that's central and it's something that's crucial. In Iowa City, our way of relating is culturally contextualized by the relationship of home ownership to the American dream, which stretches out from westward expansion and manifest destiny in the 19th century to what we're doing today, which is kind of planting subdivisions in the fields around Iowa City and watching our town grow, as the way to satisfy the longing to make oneself at home. And what it means to make oneself at home is part of what we're really focusing on in today's conversation. How historically in this space, more or less, people have made themselves at home here. And what's at stake, what the costs are of making oneself at home. It's a good thing in some ways. It's a disconcerting thing in other ways. And so that's part of just what we're trying to unpack as a question. So the next conversation we will hold will be held here at Merge on the 20th of April when we look to some of the obstacles to home making that persist in the presence of Iowa City. Today's conversation, though, will focus on how humans have made themselves at home prior to Iowa City's even being a thing. That's what the kids are still calling it. So the format today will be as follows. First, Vera, my co-host, will be showing an image and talking about part of what the context for this is regarding some of the Going Home exhibits that the UI Stanley Museum of Art has put together. Then we'll talk to our 3 panelists, and then we'll open it up for general comments and conversations. So thank you. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Vera?
I'm Vera Rose-Smith. I'm the Associate Curator of the Legacies for Iowa Collection Sharing Project at the Stanley Museum of Art, which is inside of the University of Iowa. So I feel like an NPR broadcaster. And part of the idea for this conversation series, which Dan has so amazingly agreed to be a part of and to moderate for us, was this exhibition that we staged starting last year. It just closed down about a month ago. So I have one image to show you from the exhibition. Just one. So the exhibition was called Going Home, and I'm an architectural historian by training, and so I try to think about how and why we put images together in space, and how space creates new images for us, and how that can be the founding principle of a way of life or a way of being. So the image that I brought you is just 2 works that were in this collection that speak to the past and ideas of memory of home. The one on the left here is a work by Lil Picard, who has an amazing story. She was a journalist in Nazi Austria, and she was Jewish, and she had her press credentials revoked. She had to flee the only home she'd ever known. She came to New York City. And what would you do if you had to flee fascism and start over again? What's the very first thing you would think of?
Connect with the community at the new place.
Yeah, connecting with community. So she did that through lingerie. She became a designer of fancy lingerie and hats, and she opened her own couture shop in downtown New York City, as you do. I mean, I think that's such a revolutionary way to reclaim joy in life. And she became embroiled in the happening scene of the art world in the 50s and 1960s. And she was a little bit of a later in life artist. She'd been a journalist. She was obviously a German speaker first and learned English as an adult after this very traumatic experience of having to move here. But a lot of the works that she ended up producing were about this idea of transience in a sense of home. because she had had to move in such a dramatic way. And so this object that we included in this collection, we have all of her papers, which we're really lucky to have, because she knew everybody who was everybody. She was at Andy Warhol's parties. She was kicking it up in her 70s and 80s with the young hot artists of the day. And she produced an amazing volume of work.
Can you repeat her name?
Lil Picard. And so this object is about her ideas and rememberings of what home had meant. And it's spatialized, which again, architectural historian, I want to see space, I want to see it physical. And so it's one of these strange objects where the space that's represented isn't real. It's not a space that even if we were the proper scale to walk into the object, we could navigate with our own bodies. It is the way that memory functions. We remember certain parts of certain rooms at certain times. And I thought it was a really beautiful embodiment of this process of reworking space through memory and through time. The work next to it is a Marvin Cohn painting. Marvin Cohn was on faculty here for a very long time. And I think this has some of the same qualities where we have these glimpses of a space. And to me, they feel nostalgic. There's this really subtle blue and tan and almost pink quality to some of his planar forms here. But it's not a space we could occupy physically. It is a space of memory. It is a space that has been recreated again and again and again and worried over and made into a fragmented whole that might link us back to a particular point, but a point we can never return to. So that's how I wanted to start our conversation today, and I will walk away from the screen now.
Thank you so much. That was lovely. Interesting. We'll hold questions till the end and just kind of let things stack so that as you create it in your own memory, you'll have your own planar fragmented forms of what actually occurred there. Each get your own individual perspective. So it'd be super interesting that way. Yay! All right, our first speaker today is Cherie, I'm sorry, from the the Office of the State Archaeologist. So if you want to do your images, yeah.
Cherie, it's been fun watching your images on your desktop change.
You'll notice I like bison a lot.
Cherie will be talking to us about the earliest occupants of the land. So I wanted to give a real deep look at what it means to occupy this space.
There we go. It lives. Well, people have been occupying Iowa for more than 13,000 years. So if we're going to go back to what it looked like before people were here, we have to go back to the Ice Age. So people were probably moving into this part of Iowa at the very end of the Ice Age. It was pretty much over. The glaciers were starting to retreat. There was one final surge down to what we call the Des Moines Lobe that came down central Iowa and terminated. Actually, the state capitol is built on the terminal moraine of the last glacier to enter the state.
Is that coincidence, or did they plan that?
Well, it's a ridge, so it's up high and it drains well. So I don't think they knew it was the terminal moraine, but it was a good place to build a building.
Yeah.
So, people in Johnson County at that time, the Iowa River, the Mississippi River, those would have all been, there were still glaciers up north. Minnesota, Wisconsin, Canada were still icy. That was all melting, so all of those rivers would have been carrying huge volumes of water as that that melt came down. So it would have looked quite a bit different here. During the Ice Age, this part of Iowa was likely several degrees colder than on average than it is now. It was characterized by pine and spruce forests, so think more Canada, Wisconsin, for what this area looked like then. But as the Ice Age ended, People were moving into Iowa. They were hunting mammoths and mastodons, the giant bison, and all the really cool animals of the Ice Age, my favorites. Then things began to get gradually warmer and drier, and humans had to adapt to those changing conditions. By the Archaic period, it probably looked pretty similar to what it does now. People were hunting bison, or deer and elk, and lots of small animals, your raccoons, your rabbits, your squirrels, fish, turtles, waterfowl, things like that. It was a very diverse hunting economy then. In the woodland period, now we're talking about 2,000 years ago. Well, at the very end of the Archaic period is when agriculture first is introduced into Iowa. Down on the Illinois bottoms around St. Louis was one of the centers for the domestication of plants. And this material moved right up the Mississippi, and so in southeastern Iowa we have really early evidence of domesticated plants. People were beginning to garden, and what they were growing was the plants that they'd been collecting wild for thousands of years. Many generations of people were collecting sunflowers and quinapod, which we call lamb's quarter, amaranth, which sometimes people call pigweed, and now our very popular ancient grains. Quinapod is a relative of quinoa. Amaranth, pigweed is another ancient grain that are popular now. So those were the earliest domesticated plants that were introduced into Iowa, and that was in southeast Iowa. So by the time corn and beans didn't get here for another couple thousand years, people had been already gardening up until then. The late prehistoric populations that were living here in this area were called, what we call them, Oneota. Oneota are pretty well documented to be the ancestors of several Native American tribes. The Iowa, the Oto, the Ho-Chunk, the Missouri were all descendants of the Oneota, who also moved into Iowa out of the Illinois bottoms during the late prehistoric period. So the Iowa were here in Iowa, obviously, although sometimes it's not obvious to people since they're not here anymore. They now live in a reservation in Kansas, and also there's some in Iowa and Oklahoma. The later group to move into Iowa in the 1600s were the Sauk and the Meskwaki, who were coming down out of Wisconsin and the Michigan area. Sort of roughly speaking, the Sauk were on the east side of the Mississippi and the Meskwaki were on the west side, but there was lots of movement. So Dan asked me to talk about the housing, the houses. So these they were woodland people. They live in houses that we call wickiups. So I brought pictures because it's much easier to describe from looking at the pictures. So the three black and white pictures are from the State Historical Society of Iowa. They're all historic Meskwaki homes. This one is from about 1862. You can see they're covered with cattail mats. The other alternative is sometimes they were covered with flattened tree bark. And I included down here in the corner, the Meskwaki still build wickiups today. They are still here. They live in Tama County. They have a settlement there of land that they own as a tribe. They're self-governing. They take care of their own education system, their own health care. But they live in houses like us. They're using modern technology. They're 21st century people just like all the rest of us. But they are linked to their traditions as well. And they enjoy celebrating their traditions of being Meskwaki, their own unique culture. And they like to build wickiups. This is Jonathan Buffalo, who's the Tribal Historic Preservation Specialist. And he builds a wickiup in his backyard. And you can see it's nowadays it's covered with modern things, tarps and things like that. They moved into the century with us. But it's very symbolic to him. To him, he says Meskwaki, or the wickiup is a symbol of home. So even though they have houses with central heating and everything, just like we do today, electricity, he likes to have his wickiup out back. If you go to the powwow in Tama every year in August, you'll see lots of wickiups built around the area for that too. It's a very flexible building. You can see this one would be a home. The one in the upper corner there is just, they're using it as a ramada, as for shade. Those women are sitting on a bench in there and they're weaving mats. So that version of the wickiup isn't a home, it's just a convenient shelter. This woman is getting ready to repair hers. So she's got the large cattails, which don't grow in Iowa anymore. You can see they're almost 10 feet tall. And as we've been draining our wetlands, that kind of cattail doesn't grow here anymore. What you find here is much shorter. So the Meskwaki have actually gone to Oklahoma, where they've joined the Kickapoo, and where they can still get the big cattails. So they have to go down there to get cattails to bring up here to do their mat weaving with. I wanted to show also, this is from a charming book that I just love. It's called 12 Moons, A Year with the Saucon Meskwaki. The artwork is by Tom Wilcoxon, and he has drawn these cutaway versions. The Meskwaki and the IOA as well, and many other groups, move seasonally. So in the wintertime, you don't want to be up high, you don't want to be in the wind and the cold, so they move down into the river valleys where there's lots of wood for your fires and things like that. They spread out, small family groups in their little wickiups. You might have 2 or 3 in a cluster, because you don't want to use up all the wood. If you had 300 people living in one area, by January you'd be having to go farther and farther away to get wood, and that's not something you want to be doing. So here's excuse me, a cutaway version of a winter wickiup, what it would have looked like inside. You can see winter is the storytelling time. So there's a woman down here in the corner. The kids are all hanging on the stories. The men are off in one corner chatting about something, and then the older women are doing some cooking. In the summertime, little note for environmental things, you see 2 layers of mats. There's mats on the outside, there's mats on the inside, and that creates an air pocket. For technology-wise, that's a good insulation layer. You can also move the mats around on the top. As the wind changes direction, you can rearrange the mats so that the smoke will vent out. The wind shifts, and you can change your mats around too. So they were cleverly designed. In the summertime, the Meskwaki would move. They would camp on a terrace. You don't want to be down in the bottoms during the flood season. Right now, nobody is going to be building their wickiup down there on the floodplain because it's doing its thing right now. But they would move probably to a terrace, to the uplands, where they could set up their gardens. They would come together in large groups now. And they would build larger houses. So these are the summer houses, and you can see this scene, they have just returned. So they're building one new one, they're repairing an old one. Everybody's working away on it, and here's the cutaway version of that. So you have several family groups that can live in this building. You see the mats from the winter houses are rolled up in the eaves where the smoke will keep the bugs and things from getting into them and spoiling them. There are also mats on the floors, like a carpet. No closets in a wickiup or a summer house, so you'll see bags and parfleches made out of animal skins hanging from the ceilings, and those are your closets. And I just end with, this is a living history area in Plymouth Village in Plymouth, Massachusetts. These are Wampanoag Indians, who were the ones who were here to greet the pilgrims when they arrived. in their living history farm, they actually occupy their wiki-ups. So I like to show this image just to give you an idea of what the inside of one of these places would look like occupied. They're comfy and cozy. The mats on the inside are beautifully decorated. They're woven colors and dyes. People, you know, it wasn't just a matter of survival. People like art. People like to have nice things around them. You can see the bags and baskets hanging from the ceiling. You can see the beds and the fur-covered mats and things like that. And it looks quite comfy.
Great. No,
Dumped a whole lot of information there.
That's fascinating. Just a few other questions.
Sure.
So you talk a little bit about how geography and weather play a role in where people make themselves at home, and just the location of things like wood or food sources,
Resources, yeah.
and things like that. What else was it that you've been able to find in your role as an archaeologist that constituted home? Like, as opposed to just a dwelling space or a location, what was it that made a place home, do you think?
Well, it's hard to say for these people, but they identified with the land. If you read anything about even, say, the Navajo, the Dene, the mountains around them are the 4 sacred mountains, and they only feel at home within that. That's where their sacred traditions are located. The same thing for people living in this region. Their sacred traditions are tied to the rivers and the landforms. Some of these landforms might be places where, you know, something in your spiritual tradition took place. You know, we emerged from that cave right there. So it's a spiritual connection as well as a physical connection.
So storytelling is a big part of that too. And the kind of stories that get told around the fire or things like that during the wintertime. Okay. And the other question I had was in terms of community. What's the relationship between the way that buildings are designed and the workings of the larger community? Can you shed some light on that?
Yes, it's a very mutual support system. So you might have relatives living together in one area. So we talk about the women did a lot of the work. The women did a lot of the farming and things like that, but not by themselves. They had their sisters and their mothers and their aunts. In fact, usually your mother's relatives were all called mother. They didn't distinguish the same way we do. And those people all helped. In fact, Buffalo Bird Woman, who is a Hidatsa woman who lived in the late 19th and early 20th century and was a informant for Gilbert Wilson, an anthropologist. When they moved to the reservation, and they were each family, individual nuclear family was given a house, she said that was a horrible way to live. She said, you're so isolated, you're all by yourself, you have to do all the work by yourself, and there's nobody to talk to while you do it. She said, when we lived in an earth lodge, they might have had 20, 25 people living in an earth lodge together. But as the women worked, they chatted, they sang, and so you had that mutual support system. So the community was really important that way.
How much of that sense of community and landedness it persists in current tribes?
I think quite a bit. They are connected to one another as by being Meskwaki or Dene or Ho-Chunk or something. That's part of their identity. And again, the mutual support system. That's why they stay together, even though they might be in might be able to move away and get a better job or something like that, but they prefer to stay where people understand their frame of reference.
Yeah. And then the other question that I had based off your talking, thank you so much for preparing all those images and everything too. That was wonderful. What is it about the shape of a wiki-up that you think really persists, and even for your friend, in terms of being a meaningful shape of what that kind of inside space looks like, or the outside space, or the relationship between them? Can you just talk about that kind of home construction and why that persists as something that's still important?
Well, part of it is it's very practical. Dome shapes are easy to heat. the same thing with a teepee, the conical shape. We have our high vaulted ceilings, and a lot of our heat is up there in the wintertime where there's nobody up there. So having a dome shape keeps the heat down. So there's a practical design to it as well. Plus many Native American spiritual traditions have this tradition of the circle, the never-ending cycle of life, and circular things are important to them as well.
Great. Okay. Anything else that you'd like to add, or?
Oh, probably not right now. Okay, we can go into it later if there's more.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. All right, and now Laura, who teaches American Studies and English at the University of Iowa.
Yeah, hi, yeah. I really focus oftentimes in my own work on the 19th century, actually the late 18th through the 19th century. And I teach American history and culture, literature and culture. But I got very, very interested in the period of the 1830s in Johnson County in particular, because I firmly believed that this was not always the city of literature. And, and in fact, it was not really founded by agriculturalists. And so I became interested in the fur trade. And the reason Iowa City grew here and was supposedly founded here, it was founded in a kind of traditional way, had everything to do with 3 villages of Meskwaki, probably maybe more at different times, who were here in the 1830s because several fur traders were also in the area, and there was a fur trade economy that was very complex and important, but the fur traders, being agents of industrial capitalism and in fact an international fur trade with all kinds of global connections, employed the Meskwaki as laborers, really, as workers, though they had considerable autonomy in a variety of ways, and were the contact people. The fur traders were the contact people for those farmer settlers or settler colonial figures who began to move across the Mississippi River after Black Hawk's War in 1832. And when those early farmer figures, they were actually from Indiana, came over the Mississippi River, they were met, the very early ones, in Davenport by John Gilbert, a local fur trader, who said, because he was also a land speculator, said, hey, there's a great place to settle down by the Iowa River where I have a fur trading establishment. So that began the flow of initially family groups from Indiana traveling across through the prairie land, the mixed timber and prairie of Illinois, and over the Mississippi River into what was formerly controlled by Sauk and Meskwaki peoples, this area in eastern Iowa, which was turned over to the federal government under the Black Hawk Treaty, the first one of 1832, followed by the second Black Hawk Treaty, very rapidly, and the creation of something called Keokuk's Reserve. These 3 treaty lines in the 1830s had a single meeting point, which was in Johnson County, right where John Gilbert had his fur trading operation. And he settled his fur trading establishment in today's Napoleon. He named Napoleon because he was Napoleonic. He was, and also, of course, Napoleon had been the person who deeded over the Louisiana Purchase to Jefferson, which is kind of the early geopolitics of this area, the Louisiana Purchase area. But again, the city of literature takes its rise from these federal treaties and settler colonial processes that emerged in the context of and out of this fur trading environment where a multi-ethnic French native fur trade was creating an economy that was the prelude to the coming of what I would summarize as the grid. When Cherie talked about the circle of the Wickiup, what my interest has been in the 1830s in Johnson County is what was the transition like from circle to square, in essence. What happened when these settlers flooded into this area and came into contact with this fur trade and the peoples involved with it, who were not pursuing an economic practice that was rooted in the commodification of the land itself. The fur trade obviously took place in relationship to animal bodies. And the fur trade in Iowa and in today's United States is massively understudied. In fact, Canada has given traditionally much more attention to its fur trade history. We tend to believe, wrongly, that the settler colonial or Euro-American economic structures were primarily and initially agricultural. And certainly that was that had a lot of truth to it, but the fur trade remains really a kind of important core. So why don't I put up my slide?
Yeah.
Could I briefly?
Yeah.
Find it here. Oh, did I do it wrong? Oh, there we go.
Just take it
Okay.
out.
You could just
There we go. Oh, there we go. I just love this, Iowa City. So I couldn't refrain from.
Is that an event happening this year? Or is that?
That happened a year and a half ago when someone who teaches in Native and Indigenous Studies here decided to lead a tour of Iowa City, not looking at the little book plaques on the ground, but asking where the Meskwaki were situated, what the landscape looked like before the settler colonial movement into this direct place. This is just a tip. Lance Foster is an Iowa artist and writer who has several books that are really beautiful, but one of them is called Indians of Iowa. It's short and he has illustrated it. So that storytelling world is still very much part of Iowa culture, and Lance Foster is a present-day practitioner of stories and histories of Indigenous peoples in Iowa. This is one of his images, and I just pull it up because the first agriculturalists, of course, in the upper Midwest were largely women, if not primarily and solely women in many situations. And when the white settlers came in the 1830s, it was very common for them to be highly critical of the way in which Native communities supposedly worked their women as a kind of drudge or drudges, and the men, by contrast, in Native communities they criticized, were not independent landowners who were in charge of the agricultural labor. This is called the gender frontier, that in fact the whites had a gender frontier, which meant the man was in charge of and possessing of the property gridded out in a square, but the women from the late 18th into the early 19th century largely did work in the interior of the home, which was also square, and was in charge of the reproductive and household labor within the home. Of course, women had gardens, and it wasn't that clear always, but that gender frontier, the agricultural gender frontier of the Euro-Americans, contrasted sharply with the gender frontier, or it wasn't a frontier, right? The gender, sex-gender system of the indigenous peoples of Iowa who were part of the fur trade. In those cases, in the seasonal migrations that Cherie is talking about, the summer villages would be built in the, not the bottomland per se, but in a kind of, what do you call those?
Up on a terrace.
A terrace. The terraces, which are just above, because if you go too far down, it's risky and maybe too cold, so you go up slightly. But the women would create in the summer, in fact in the spring of course, these really large plantations of corn and other foods, squash and beans, the whole complex of Meskwaki usufruct, as opposed to agriculture, usufruct relationship to horticulture. And these could be as, really, really large, 2 miles in length, conceivably. Does that make sense?
They could grow enough food to supply not only their whole family through the winter and into the next, because you had to go until the next harvest, but also to have a surplus to trade.
Right.
So,
and vacation. In the division of labor of the fur trade, then, it would be the men who would pursue the furs and negotiate the trade of fur with people like John Gilbert, who founded Napoleon here in Johnson County. However, of course, the women were a very big part of the fur trade as well, because beeswax and other things like feathers were part and parcel of the gathering and selling that eventually funneled furs and other forest products from the fur trading establishment of Gilbert, Wheaton Chase, Alexander Ross. There were 3 major traders in this area in the 1830s. They would be gathered there and then shipped down the Iowa River from the fur trading establishment, and then all the way down to St. Louis, where the fur traders would exchange those forest materials for manufactured goods shipped up through the Gulf of Mexico, around and ferried up to St. Louis. That is manufactured goods. So we're talking, an early industrial situation where the trade is dependent on metal and textile and glass bead manufacturers and tool manufacturing that would create the infrastructure that eventually would produce the city of Iowa City, which required that kind of technological infrastructure that the fur trade itself enabled, pulling up these materials through river transportation. Steamboats as early as 1839 were showing up right here in Johnson County in Iowa City. And it's the river system that really, really defines and marks the world of the 1830s, the world of the so-called founding of Iowa City, which is usually traced to a kind of mythology, the city's mythology, that there were 3 founders. Chauncey Swan, John Ronalds. Ronalds Street is named for John Ronalds. And Robert Ralston. Ralston Creek is named for Robert Ralston. But supposedly, these 3 men were sent by Governor Lucas out of Burlington, the capital at the time, to go up to Iowa City, this area, it wasn't Iowa City at the time, to go up to John Gilbert's fur trading establishment and find a place for the new territorial capital. So actually, Ralston was late. He wasn't part of the deal. It was Ronald and Chauncey Swan who rode their horses out, found a place on a bluff, and looked around and said, it looks like a fabulous amphitheater. So an amphitheater, of course, being a quite, aestheticizing visual picture from neoclassical forms. It's an amphitheater. And from our elevated position, we found this territorial capital here. So that's the mythological story of the founding, and it continues to be traced to that sort of 3 white men from Burlington planting a stake, when in fact there were only 2 of them, and long story, but I guess I have one little story to tell you, and then maybe I'll just let Dan ask me questions, which is a story of what happened when some of the families started to show up here. Because the first groups of colonializing settlers to cross the Mississippi into the Black Hawk Purchases were mostly single men. A few of them stayed during the winter to chop wood by the Mississippi River for the steamboat trade, but they were single men primarily, who then would go and get their families back at the hometown or the home farm where they had been safely ensconced until the claim had been established. When those women and children began to come, by that time, Gilbert's trading post was still a center for a kind of catalyst for the individuals who came to what became Johnson County. But there were now a bunch of claim cabins. There was a settlers' claim society through which they protected each other's claims until this area could be converted to public land and sold officially. But there were also a few other structures, and one of them was called Lean Back Hall. This was a long shack, which was kind of a makeshift hotel for individuals to stay in until claims and cabins could be built within the watershed of Ralston Creek, this world that had been founded. And within it, women and children could stay divided from the men by puckaway mats. Mats traded from the Meskwaki in lieu of blankets to divide the lean back hall into parts so that women could be segregated from men. And in addition, allow me to say, lean back hall was furnished as follows. On either side, there were brush beds laid down covered with slough grass, because everywhere around here was wet prairie, timber, creeks, flooding. It was a swampy mess, except for these elevated points. and slough grass was laid over the brush, and puck-away mats laid on top of that. And then long, 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 long pillows were created out of cloth, stuffed with feathers of ducks and geese, shot locally in the watershed of the Iowa River and its tributaries. And these waterway animals serviced these early settlers in the form of pillow down. Also, these men and women were supported by a local cook named Mrs. Cole, a settler woman who served them food. A man was in charge who brewed up the whiskey out of spring water and sugar. Spring water coming from Ralston Creek, because there were springs in Ralston Creek. There probably still are, but they're buried now. Up off of Iowa Avenue, there were several springs. But I just wanted to underline this contact world, which is made up of a complex of environmentally local materials, Meskwaki support and trade, and the arrival of settlers who were often supremely hapless, needed the support. And there's many, many stories of the Meskwaki offering material support to the early settlers, and the settlers being radically dependent on them. So we know that eventually, and I could show you pictures of the grid that gets laid down, which is the surveying of Iowa City. And we think that the survey grid, we believe wrongly that the survey grid somehow was always here. But of course, in fact, the landscape was defined by the waterways and by the sloughs and by the animals that lived here and by the cultures that grew up in relationship to the animal communities, as well as, of course, the plant communities. So I'll just show you one more. This is just a picture of the river system and the timber. 20% of Iowa was timber. And those timbered creeks were the locus of settlement initially, because that's where the timber was, of settlement, white settlement, but also were the places where the animals were hunted during those winter hunting journeys that Sherry was sketching out for us. So here's Iowa City, right about here, if I'm getting it right, and we're about 60 miles from Davenport, at the juncture of Ralston Creek and the Iowa River. So this is the landscape before the grids. 20% timber, wet prairie, and you can see all the lakes up here. This is that Des Moines lobe that Cherie was talking about, which left all of this liquid and swamps. And here's the technique, or the technology, really. It's a visual technology using survey chains through which the land was laid off into squares, which translated that land into commodities which could be bought and sold. So you usually think of a factory as a technology that industrializes. Really, the survey, which is so simple, is an industrial technology that converts land into exchange value, into commodities. That's just the grid. I can get this to go one further. I get it? This is Iowa City when it's gridded out. And there's 1 million of these pictures for every small town in the upper Midwest and the far West. This is the image of settlement that marks and defines the settler colonial culture that follows the fur trade and lays itself out in this particular propertied grid. So I'll just stop there, I think. I have one very last point, which is until 1980, when Ralston Creek's 2 tributaries were impounded with dam-like structures to control their flooding, every few years, Iowa City was visited by hugely destructive floods stemming from the creek. So the act of founding Iowa City in the amphitheater crossed by Ralston Creek, our only urban watershed, really, here in Iowa City, was a very foolhardy moment. Because stories in Iowa City going back to the 1840s record flood after flood after flood after flood, and homes flooded in their basements, people, especially poor people who lived down by Ralston Creek, being jettisoned from their homes. Ralston Creek reacted again and again and again to the settlement around it in a way by repeatedly flooding out the people that were living closest to it, or really giving them wet basements every year. These stories are everywhere in Iowa City, the stories of the floods. We forget that on the surface of the present when we don't get reminded by Ralston Creek of its true role and place in this, what was a very soggy community for a very long time.
We've got that under control now, right?
It's
We've tamed Ralston Creek.
Right.
It's
I don't know, I was getting
domesticated.
water out of my basement just the other day.
Great. Well, thank you so much. That was great. Yeah, no, it was a huge amount of history, really condensed, and it gave, I think, a good sense of what Iowa City is and where it comes from before it was the city of literature. So
Yeah,
I just want to make a point that wiki-ups don't have basements.
and Jonathan Buffalo will say that and will remind us of how flooding
They're also not tied to one place.
Right.
You
Right.
move.
Right.
Move the people, not the resources.
and the floods, they clean out, he would say, they clean the places around the rivers every year, and they create new soil, which makes that area rich. So I mean, he's really sensitive to that.
you've done some work on Ralston Creek in particular and just what that waterway is and means. Can you hold forth a little bit on just the relationship between making oneself at home and the activity of Ralston Creek aside from flooding? Like what is it in terms of homemaking, in terms of milling, in terms of those kinds of technologies, in the ways that Iowa City has produced itself around that area? Can you just describe the relationship between making oneself at home and water?
Well, there were a few actually very small mills built on on Ralston Creek, mostly wood turning establishments. In fact, some of the first chairs in the old Capitol, old chairs, were worked by mills on Ralston Creek. The major sawmills, though, were on Rapid Creek. And eventually then on the Iowa River over where Coralville, you know, that, what do they call it, the Water Power restaurant is, that place was a huge place of local investment in milling. Flour mills really emerged there. But the sawmill on Rapid Creek produced the wood that built the old Capitol, while on littler Ralston Creek, small kinds of mills were established which produced small wood items for people and for buildings. So the sawmill industry was really something that was rooted in the creation of home and in the kind of conversion of the landscape from this sort of well-watered, timbered area into a kind of fenced. You need sawmills to help you create the wood that will build the towns. So the sawmills were indispensable all across the country, of course, but also very locally right here to the conversion of the timber into usable, commodifiable wooden objects. I don't know if that helps.
Mm-hmm. And to follow up a little bit on that, in terms of what it means to grid a space rather than wiki up, can you just talk about what the Lucas plan was to just impose squares over the region? The ways, I mean, because you're hinting at the ways that sawmills are used to translate, you know, a diverse landscape that has valleys and things into just kind of grid, right? And so there's technologies that go along with that, but can you describe a little bit more where the grid, the logic of the grid comes in, and how the logic of the grid transforms how we occupy a space, just more in terms of community or in terms of daily?
Well, one thing the grid does is it creates spaces that are owned by individuals. So it's an intrinsically kind of isolating and patriarchal form. First of all, because women and children were covered, according to the law of coverture, in this settlement process, were covered by the landowner who owned the property, who was always male. So this high level of individualism associated with getting a title to your land tended to isolate Americans into individual units. And of course, the native peoples in this country were highly victimized by this same ideology and ideal of the property-owning individual, because there were innumerable attempts to convert native peoples to agriculture and land owning, and to move native women inside by teaching them spinning and sewing and homemaking. This was a process of cultural erasure under the rubric of assimilation that aimed to isolate and individuate Meskwaki into American citizens in a world where citizenship was rooted in property law, property in land, and title in property. You can't be a self unless you have a title. Then you're entitled.
That's worked out really well for us.
The root system of this grid, of course, goes way back to Jefferson, who innovated it really in those Northwest territorial processes to take new land and convert it into territories owned by the federal government. You use this grid process, which was, of course, highly rational and simple. It turns everything into an interchangeably identical part. So it's just a kind of incredible device, and Jefferson laid it out there, and while he was supported by his upwards of 125 slaves. So, okay, just saying.
Yeah. So one other question, if you don't mind going into, I know that you've done work on Black Hawk Park, and Park 201, and just in terms of what Iowa City means in the history of Iowa City as it's spatially represented in terms of homes, I'd be really interested if you could just give us a nutshelled encapsulation of what Black Hawk was, what Black Hawk Park was, and what Park 201 is. Because that's something that you've thought through, I believe. Yeah?
I have. I cannot adequately explain who Black Hawk was, except to say that he was the
very angry sock.
A very angry sock who didn't actually fight a war, but evaded an attempt to move him across the Mississippi River, producing a war that then turned over, extracted all this land from the Sauk, Meskwaki, and others. So Black Hawk in the 1970s, we're talking about Black Hawk Park. Black Hawk Park was founded or created in the 1970s when a bunch of students sat in those sit-ins, in that space, so-called Black Hawk Park. Y'all know what I'm talking about. It's been taken over by the Moyne Building, that area. It's kind of towering Moyne Building. In the 1970s, there was all this urban renewal, and they dug up that area, and it was kind of obliterated. There was an erasure of what had been there, older older structures. And in the pits, in the holes in the ground there, came these students. And eventually, local supporters, green space advocates, helped to convert that area into a place with plants and worked it so that it got turned into a people's park, a public park. It's a public park, technically and legitimately, that space. It's owned for the public. And in the 70s then, once it was sort of, trees were planted and little benches were put around, because urban renewal was so ugly, a local art teacher in the university, and I'm very sorry I'm forgetting her name, I know it very well, you can access, if you look up Black Hawk Park in the little village, she's written several articles about the 1970s history of Black Hawk Park. At that time, in the 70s, this art teacher took her students, university art students, and they made a mural on the side of that building, which is now where all those psychologists have their offices up there on the second floor, where Artisan Gallery is, that side of the building. And they painted a picture of Black Hawk, the sock, as a figure for liberation, it being the 70s. And of course, as a white person's or a white student's, because they were mostly white artist people who were doing this, sense of identification with Native Americans as figures for liberation and freedom. That was a very hippie-like kind of move to make. Nevertheless, the figure of Black Hawk overlooked that people's park, that public park, until the early 80s, when Ralston Creek was impounded, and was surrounded by images of birds, like hawks, that rose in the air above him all the way to the top of the building. Also at that time, there was a mural of buffalo that accompanied it. And I don't know if you guys were aware of this mural, but it was revealed when that new Moyne building was built. Before they built the building, they tore out a bunch of old walls, and they exposed the buffalo from the Black Hawk mural.
Donna Friedman.
Donna Friedman, oh thank you, Donna Friedman. Donna Friedman. And you can go to Little Village, and they took really great photos of this really crude set of buffalo. But for a very short time before the Moyne building went up, there were a bunch of buffalo walking across what used to be Black Hawk Park, which is still Black Hawk Park, but we don't remember it as Black Hawk Park.
Some of us do.
I do.
Well,
Baskin and Robbins was across from that mural, so I remember it really well.
that's right. Well, I'm so used to talking to undergraduates, and I always say, we don't remember it. But I totally appreciate there are plenty of people that remember it. Yeah, who can tell the story of that park.
So I have a question about squares. What makes squares more commodifiable than circles in terms of grid works?
No leftovers.
Yeah,
No
there's leftover
leftovers.
space.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I just think of tomatoes. When you buy them in the store, they're made into a kind of packable square. I think the principle of interchangeability and the mass reproduction of an original, I think packaging. I don't know if that's even part of an answer. Maybe
Yeah, the no leftover space.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be no person's land, right? If you had a circle and you had another circle next to it, there's that space. And
Yeah.
So you could have triangles, but then you just split them into squares in half. So.
No, yeah.
So we have a no space left behind policy.
No awkward corners.
No awkward.
No
yeah.
awkward corners. And
All
that's,
must be owned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's-
Accounted for.
thank you. No, that's where the principle of redevelopment comes in, right? When you find that you have a space that is supposedly blighted or marginal, oh, well, that's a call to redevelop it and make it newly economically productive. And that's what the principle of redevelopment in this country, in this city, really operates along.
Great, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
That was wonderful. And now we have our third panelist, Zoe, who's a graphic designer at Hampshire. And your work is not quite as far back.
Yes, it's about 100 years in the future.
Yeah. You were responsible for the nightlife installation at Revival last April as part of the Dazzle Crawl, and you were there both as a representative of Hampshire and as an artist, so you had both of your hats on. And can you just describe, just first of all, in terms of that overlap of business and art and city and university and community, can you just describe what you thought of that event, or give a little bit of context for that event, and then opine?
Yeah, that event was an overlap of a lot of things. I mean, with my, so I work at Hampshire as the graphic designer, and the origin of that event was we had Taylor Mack, the performance artist, coming in to do a performance of his 24-hour history of United States piece, which is sort of this gay fantasia of history of the last 100 years through song. And he was bringing his collaborator, Machine Dazzle, who is this wild, incredible artist who creates all of Taylor's costumes and props, and they're like wearable sculptures that kind of tell history and are just these fabulous objects at the same time. So they were coming in, and at Hampshire, we wanted to do something, you know, not just present the performance, but to do something to kind of lead up to this. So we had this idea of partnering with Public Space One and getting a bunch of local artists to do storefront installations around town about the theme of Iowa City history. Since the show itself was about history, we thought, why not do this thing about Iowa City history? So Vero was one of the artists. And another one of my co-workers at Hampshire is one of the artists. So I basically like commissioned myself, basically, because I was like, oh, I want to do this so bad. All of the artists, there was 11 artists, and we all met and we talked about our ideas. And I just felt like someone has to do something gay. Like, this piece is so...
It's not gay enough.
It's not gay enough, and it's so super gay, and it's like, Machine Dazzle's gonna be here, and like, we need to gay it up. And, you know, as a gay person and an Iowa City native, I felt like I am the beneficiary of so much history here, of, you know, people who have come before me and fought the fights and done the dangerous things, you know, so that we could be the third state in the nation to have gay marriage, and you know, and that I could live a pretty comfortable, conflict-free existence, you know. So I felt like I wanted to do a shout out to that history of Iowa City and celebrate those people. So going into my piece, I'd been paired with Revival right across the street, so I wanted to do something fashion related. And I guess I had this really ignorant thought that I would be able to find period photos of people in Iowa City gay bars in the 60s and 70s and 50s, and I would just blow those up and put them up there. And I quickly realized that these photos don't exist, because, of course, people going to gay bars in the 50s and 60s did not want their picture taken. And also, no one had phones with cameras or anything like that. The technology just wasn't there. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to have to cast this and you know, dress people up and like kind of create these scenarios and shoot them. So that is the backstory of that. So I come at this research from a very different perspective. You know, as an artist, I basically wanted to get the flavor of what, you know, the gay safe spaces were in Iowa City in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. And what were people doing there, and what did they look like, what were they doing with their bodies, what were they wearing. You know, so my research uncovered, you know, secret coffee houses that changed locations for safety, and, you know, women's groups that met in RAC, and, you know, and bars, and, you know, there are, I didn't know what I was going to find, but there's always safe spaces, you know, even if you don't know what they are. I mean, and it was interesting because I had such a hard time even finding any photographic evidence of these spaces because they just,
They were good at keeping it.
they were good at keeping it secret, yeah. I can show you some of what I found if that's of interest.
You could just come down the bottom, hit the little dash.
Little dash.
Yeah.
You have to, how about the, you
Oh,
need to
okay.
answer the question. Yeah, just say.
Don't
cancel.
say.
Yeah.
Don't say. I'm used to using a trackpad, it feels so Okay, so this is one of the earliest spaces that I found photographic evidence of. It's a bar called Kenny's.
What street is that on?
I think it was at a couple of different locations, but I think this is Clinton Street. So, and apparently this was a big hangout of people from the Writers' Workshop, and apparently there's more written about Kenny's than any other bar in American history.
That's what happens with writers.
Because, yeah, the writers
So
hang out
this
there.
is when we become the city of literature.
Yes, apparently. So that was around for many years. Let me get my notes here.
Where did you find this stuff out? Like, where did you go for it?
There is a Facebook group called, like, History of Iowa City, or like, and I just posted on there, I was like, hey, gay people, where did you hang out? Like, and people chimed in. So,
Zoe, that's really important work that maybe hasn't been documented in this way before.
No.
I know, really, someone more qualified than me should
I
do
want you to
it.
write something about it.
Yeah, this is an article from 1950 from the Daily Iowan talking about an assault that took place at Kenny's. Someone broke a bar glass and attacked someone, and it's like, what was the story there? We'll never know. This was a women's restaurant called Grace and Ruby's that existed. It was a private club and meeting place for women, 1976 through 78. Here's their kitchen. Here's a bunch of lesbians in the 60s hanging out. And I feel like looking at these pictures, I'm like, I know these people. I need to like post these and be like, is that you? The Plainswoman bookstore.
Oh.
I'm not sure. Oh, apparently it was the second level of 529 Gilbert Street. I couldn't find a photo of it. Oh, there was this woman's coffee house. Looks so innocuous, right? And these lesbians having soup suppers. It was interesting through my research. It's like all the women would get together and like have soup and coffee, and all the men would just like drink and like dance. So here we are having some soup in the 70s. So yeah, found a lot of posters. Of course, the Gay People's Union through the university. EPB was, what did you say, the English and
Yeah, that's the English department.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
This is an article in the Daily Iowan about a gay social dance, and you can see how hot it was from like 4 people who were there dancing on me.
I know you know, is that what that pumpkin was saying? Could you?
Oh yeah, this pumpkin says, I know you know. And this pumpkin says, I'm one too. Yeah, so RAC was a space where lesbians met. Basement of the Unitarian Church was a site of a lot of gay and lesbian dances. So this was like as recent as 1984, this article about, nuclear arms to kill all gays, death to all gays, spray painted outside RAC, a pipe bomb pipe bomb was thrown into Halsey Gymnasium. There was graffiti outside the 620 Club, which I'll talk about it. Could not find any pictures of the 620 Club. And that's the one that I remember going to in the 90s. But no one took pictures. And of course, Studio 13, which is the one that still exists today, which before that was the Alley Cat. So I know there was a space in the late 60s and early 70s called the Boulevard Room, and then it was called That Bar, that was owned by someone in the math department, Eugene Madison.
Eugene Madison and his
wife. And it was known to be a gay-friendly space, apparently. So so this was my piece in Revival. I wanted to do these life-size cutouts of people from all different eras. So we've got couples up here from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, people dancing. I just wanted to have this a big party with everyone. Let's all get together and just have fun. There it is during the daytime. There it is from behind. So if I would have known how much work that piece was going to be, I don't know that I would have done it. But I cast people, makeup artist, shot photos against a green screen. My cat helps. Cut them out, printed them life-size. Cut them out on a laser printer. Chuck Romans from Proto Studios down the hall cut these out for me on a laser printer. So put them back in there, things like that, and then installed them over at Revival. These were my 50s. I wanted to have at least one drag king and one drag queen, so it's my drag king. And I just wanted to show people just hanging out, having a good time. I decided in the end to focus on nightlife, to focus on nighttime safe spaces as opposed to the coffee houses and the women's groups. Because I just wanted to be really joyous and colorful and, kind of really easy to understand at a glance. So that was that piece. Let's go back to kind of Okay.
So Iowa City considers itself, pretty much everybody thinks of Iowa City as being progressive in terms of a home for different kinds of people to feel at home. Mm-hmm. Given your research, how true is that? Or what does it mean to feel at home in a place, or in a progressive place, where you still have to have quiet, secret, safe spaces where people can't be photographed and locations have to shift and there's graffiti and bombs and what does that mean?
I mean, I can't speak to those people's experiences, but I imagine that I think the LGBT community was probably instrumental in making Iowa City progressive and kind of pushing that forward. But I think having, being able to, you said something really great where people want to stay where people understand their frame of reference, and I think, the gay bar as a sanctuary and a place of safety is crucial, and I think a place where you can get together and relax and let your guard down and know that you're around people who understand you, then kind of gives you the armor you need to go out and either play a role that you need to play to survive, or to, be in the minority and kind of have to constantly be explaining yourself or justifying yourself. So I don't know, it's sanctuary and home are kind of two different things. I mean, I think these bars were people's homes for, that night, that week, that year. But it's not a permanent home, it's a place they can go to the well and get that water, but then they have to leave and survive.
In terms of Iowa City as one's home, though, in that kind of larger sense of making oneself at home in a town space, how do those, what's the relationship even of Studio 13 today in having Iowa City be a place of home for people within queer communities?
Well, I think Iowa City and Iowa are very special in the nation in terms of, we were very early, gay marriage came here very early. When I was when I was living in New York, everyone was shocked that Iowa, you know, would approve gay marriage before California and New York, and I wasn't surprised, you know, because we have a culture of acceptance here that I think is kind of uniquely Midwestern, and I think, I don't know if part of it is genuine, like, a belief in civil rights, and how much of it is like, well, as long as you're not hurting me, I don't really care what you do. You know, it's kind of like the intersection of those things. But I think the culture of acceptance in Iowa and Iowa City is really unique, and I think this kind of history could not have happened anywhere else.
So one of the developments amongst the three, so you've gone from like the circular community, right, to the gridded out individual area, but the space of what a public space is, right, is a different kind of space. It's neither one nor the other exactly, but in terms of a secret public space, you know, that's a different kind of sense of what home, kind of a thing that's necessary for people to feel at home, this weird like secret public. That isn't public, right? But it's not private either. Can you just talk a little bit about what you were learning about those kinds of really strange spaces that aren't public, they're not private, they're not exactly communal for everybody, right? But they're not individual either in that kind of isolating way. Can you just describe that a little bit?
I can't imagine what it must have been like to be, you know, a lesbian in the 60s. You know, I wish, you know, I wish I could have done firsthand interviews. I think that would really be the next step of like making this actual robust research. But you know, I can't imagine what it would be like to have to hide your sexuality, you know, in the classroom, at work, you know, in public, and then only at night be able to like put on your outfit under your coat, you know, slink down to Grace and Ruby's or whatever, and then be able to be at home. You know, it's like the delay of that, being able to relax. I don't know how people did it. I mean, I think it's a level of low or high level tension that you must carry with you all the time.
Yeah, I'd be interested in the communication. How did you make the connections to find out about these places? That must have been extremely complicated.
Yeah.
Just go to the English
pre-internet.
department. 304 UPB what did you figure out? I was really interested in the distinction that you made between women having coffee and soup and men going out to drink. Can you describe a little bit about, in terms of even what it means to have a home, those are very different models of what home making looks like.
Yeah, I know. Right?
Would you, again, just kind of talk about
I mean, I don't want to make any broad generalizations, but just I noted in my research that women tended to get together during the day for soup and coffee and conversation, and men tended to get together late at night for dancing and alcohol. So,
draw what conclusions.
Draw what conclusions you make.
Okay, fair. Let me see. In terms of, so this is again part of the UI theme semester on American Dreams. And in terms of what people have dreamed of in your research, in terms of a progressive community where one can feel at home publicly, do you think that we're moving in a direction toward the realization of the dreams of the people that you studied, or are we moving in a direction in accordance with other people's dreams?
I don't know if I can parse that question. I mean, I think I can only imagine, you know, in the 50s and 60s, early 60s, the dream was just to survive and to maybe find someone like you and maybe be able to experience love, you know, and like a loving relationship, even if in secret, you know. And I think perhaps in the 60s and 70s it changed to, you know, the civil rights era was happening, and it was about like, oh no, we can be out and part of society, and there's nothing to be ashamed of, and you know, we're just people, you know, and then so it's interesting. I think the dream, I mean, even for me, like when I was a little girl, like it never occurred to me that I would be able to marry another woman someday. It was just like, that's not for me, you know, and I just accepted that. And I mean, and thank God, people, you know, pushed for that, who did see that and did believe in the equality of that. Because I think it's so easy to just accept what lot you have and just, oh, maybe if I could have a little more, that would be great. But to really dream it forward, that takes vision and courage and a lot of strength.
So you feel, to what extent do you feel like you can make yourself at home in Iowa City?
Oh, to a great extent. I mean, it's funny for me because this is my home. I mean, I was born in Iowa City. I was born in University Hospital. I went to Shimmick and Southeast and City High. And the theme of coming home, going home is very personal to me because I left to go to college. I went to college in Pittsburgh, and then I lived in New York City for almost a decade. And then this urge for home just was like, I just wanted to go home. And you know, and it wasn't really logical. And it was like, well, what am I, you know, I'm not going to have a career in Iowa City. Like, there's not going to be a job for me there. But I just wanted to, and so I did, and I'm so glad I did. But there is something about feeling like you have a claim to the land. I mean, even though I don't own any land, but just I am of this place. You know, I'm a product of this school system. I'm a product of this Ped Mall. You know, like I played on that structure. Well, not that structure, but the one that was there in the 70s and 80s. And you know, so I feel like it's mine. You know, and it's like in New York City, like I didn't feel like, you know, I just kind of felt like apologetic and like, sorry, you know, I don't belong there. So.
Is there anything that you'd like to add that I haven't asked?
No, I don't think so. Thank you.
Great. That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's great. Are there any questions that the four of you had for each other, or anything that you were curious about? I got to ask all the questions, so if you have anything that
It's been fascinating. I think we should write a book together.
Yeah, I kind of like the gender thing.
Yeah, it's the through line.
The women's and the women's roles.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have a question?
I can add one small remark to the amphitheater image. My father was a playwright, and he spent, I think, a summer term studying under E.C. Mabie before 1940. But at that time, they put on plays not only in, what's the building? McBride. But also in the summer, they would use the terrace below the old Capitol as a theater space. And he remembers performing there. So it was an amphitheater.
Darren?
Thanks for, I didn't know the fur trading history down here. I knew it in the Northeast, so I really appreciate that. I was thinking while you were talking that there was a shift then, if I understand what you're saying, from the value of the furs and the animals being in their use for the people who had them to their market value somewhere else. And I wonder, you know, a lot of the mythology of the Midwest is of local control, local values, but I wonder if maybe that's not so true, that when we move to agriculture, we move to industrial, that really it's Chicago, London, Paris, New York, wherever that really sets. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. That the processes that created Iowa were urban and had a lot to do with industrialization and urbanization manifesting here. The rapidity with which the railroads crisscrossed Iowa happened in the 50s, 1850s. So that you're talking the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, you've got Rock Island Road coming all the way up from Davenport to Iowa City.
Thinking of all these big block by block apartments, but it's not local money, right? I mean, those are all national, international funds, right? That are really shaping our community.
Yeah. That's one of the points I wanted to make, that Iowa is, well, it's a commonplace of the so-called prairie state of Iowa, that it's the most industrialized landscape, one of the most industrialized landscapes in the United States. The transformation of the prairie into the grid of agriculture is a mark of industrialized agriculture.
Has the least amount of unused space in the state, yeah.
1% is unmodified.
I think, yeah, if that's even still true. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, everything is used here.
Even the swamp, found a way to use the swamp to drain it.
Yeah, the drainage history is one of the great transformations. All those lakes, there's an article called The Lost Lakes of Iowa, because all those lakes that speckled that center, and they're all gone, the vast majority of them, and they were all wetlands and had wetland ecologies.
Yeah.
I had two very strong reactions to the Wikia images. Opposite strong reactions. So first the reaction was, that looks so cozy, the winter Wikia, to be surrounded by family like that while it's cold outside. You have the fire at the center and your storytelling. But then the other strong reaction, I'm an amateur poet and I need a blank page to be creative, I've discovered. So that was too cluttered and there were too many people. Like, I have to find some other individual space to write my poetry in. So like, yay settlers for bringing me my home with a study. And not patriarchal, that was artistic, my reaction to that.
Well, they say the book is the first industrial commodity.
Yeah.
The printing press and the reproduction of the original as a book in the 1500s.
I think a lot of times ideas of home are related to ideas of privacy. And privacy has changed so much over human history, and I think increasingly so and acceleratedly so with the innovations that we now face with social media, with objects that bring us to others, but in a very abstracted way in real time. I think that there's been a lot of panic about social media in particular and these new technologies of connection when it comes to, you just look at a screen, you're not talking to people. And that there's this sense of a loss of privacy. But we're actually still so spatially isolated that this idea of individual rooms for individual activities is very, very European. But it's pretty modern European. Like, that didn't exist in a lot of Europe either until maybe 600-700 years ago. So how do we comport privacy with home? And it comes back to these spaces that have to be created outside of a domestic space for people that can't feel a sense of privacy or home at their actual homes where they live. And the need for documentation makes those spaces less private is something that I thought was really interesting about your work, Zoe.
Any other questions? Well, thank you so much for attending. That will bring our time to a close. Our next conversation will be back here at Merge on the 20th of April. And once again, we'll be looking at kind of the uncanny place of a home that doesn't feel like a good home, or the unsafe nature of homes, and part of what's troubling about making home in the present. So home is where the heart is, unless it can't fit there. So thank you so much for coming. Please help yourself to refreshments, talk to each other if you want, or leave.
There's a lot of LGBT history here.
I would love to know more about how people found each other.
I didn't either. This is all. Thanks for coming.